Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody joining, we hope, around the world. This is another in GMAT Club's interview prep series. I have the pleasure today of hosting a multi-school event. We're going to look at, focus on, if the word focus can be used on 9 schools, we're going to focus on a series of 9 schools, 9 US programs today. You can kind of colloquially refer to them as the T8 to T16. I think here we're basically talking about top 15, top 16 schools minus the M7. So we're going to dive into these. I think the big thing is that's a lot of schools to cover in one session, right? But we're going to do it. And B, we're going to try to keep our eye on how do we master the differences or observe the differences, sometimes subtle differences that exist between different schools, interview styles, formats, and question patterns. How do we use tools like GMAT clubs, interview debriefs, where people post publicly available interview reports? How do we use those to kind of sleuth around and identify some of these patterns? So the goal here is that you're going to have a baseline of interview prep. You say, okay, I'm ready for this kind of base, any classic MBA interview, but I can tailor that or look out for extra little things or extra little quirks that might be associated with the specific school I'm interviewing with, if it is one of these 9 schools. Who are we? Who am I? I am Greg Guglielmo. I'm the founder of Avanti Prep, MBA admissions consulting firm. We are a top-rated boutique MBA admissions consulting firm. We've been partnered with GMAT Club since 2017. We are extremely high touch, very hands-on with clients. I think you'll see that show up in our reviews. We're a very small team. I work directly with most of our clients. And so I think the experiences that our clients have had with us really do stand out for that level of high touch, that level of hands-on, both with applications and with interview prep. Our interview prep is just as high touch. It's very school specific and it's very you specific. I think a lot of that school specificity is going to come across in today's session. We're going to see, like a lot of other interview prep out there, it's just generic interview prep. It's like practice a few questions and 30 minutes of questions, 30 minutes of feedback. When we do interview prep, it's school specific and you specific. So we are in the absolute weeds on specific schools' question patterns. And then we are usually working with people who don't want just high-level feedback. They want to like really workshop answers. We could spend 15, 20 minutes working with somebody on just tell me about yourself. 15 or 20 minutes workshopping their response to why MBA and why Haas. 15 or 20 minutes on maybe 10 or 15 minutes on how they uniquely contribute. So it's really, really hands-on workshop. If you're interested in that, please feel free to reach out, avantiprep.com. And we are offering a special 15% discount to event attendees. You can see the coupon code there on the screen, GMAT Club 15. For interview prep, you probably end up working with me. I've done over 300 interview preps for usually top 15 type schools, MBA programs, over 300 discrete interview prep sessions. We have Morgan Bernstein on our team too, who is the former head of admissions at Haas, not just any old admissions member, but the former admissions head. We have other former M7 interviewers on our team as well. I actually used to interview at Haas when I was there and when I was a student member of admissions there a somewhat long time ago now. MBA interviews, it's February 11th. I don't need to go through this line by line. This is a lot of stuff I think you know at this point, and maybe you've joined a lot of the other GMAT Club interview series. They're usually by interview only, but some schools, Darden, Tuck, will allow you an open interview or a guaranteed interview. Excuse me. They're usually conducted by admissions, alumni, or students. We'll look at how that varies for these schools today. They're often 30 to 45 minutes, but that can vary as well. We'll look at some of the timing patterns because those are important to pay attention to. Some schools stay true or pretty true to like a 30 minutes. Other schools can go longer. It could be a little more unpredictable. Do not underestimate the importance of your interview. We don't want you to mail it in. think if you're joining this video, you probably are not underestimating its importance. But some people are like, hey, I made it through the hard part and I'm really good at, I'm generally a good communicator, so I'll be fine in the interview. That is not true. You need to prepare for and think about your responses, or even if you're a good communicator or feel natural in this environment, you need to think about, like, there's upside here. Maybe you were going to get in or have a good chance of getting in, but now if you nail your interview, you have a chance at a really good scholarship. So quality of your interview, specificity of your answers, thoughtfulness, fit with the school, how you'll contribute, how you'll impact that school, how you respond to different behavioral questions. These are all super important. The interview at the same time, it's not all or nothing. It's one more data point that goes back in the basket. They collect it. You get an interview report written up about you. It goes back in the basket, with everything else. It goes back with your application, your essays, your recommendations, and becomes part of that holistic review. Wear business formal, suit and tie for male applicants, and the corresponding equivalent. Business casual is only acceptable if a specific school explicitly allows it. I believe Kellogg this year has allowed business casual, but you got to look at the default. Otherwise is business attire, business formal. You could see some other notes on the page. This is a little bit of a rehash here. Business formal. If you're doing a video interview, create the sensation of eye contact. I'm trying to do it right now. Oftentimes I'll take my camera and move it up toward the bottom, up just below. So shrink the cursor, shrink the video screen, put it up under the lens, and that way you create the sensation of eye contact. You don't want to have your picture down in the corner of the screen or the bottom of your screen, and now it doesn't look like you're making eye contact. If you're doing a video interview, create the sensation of eye contact. Have photo ID handy. Some schools will ask for it. I think most schools have a policy that they're supposed to, and then interviewers just don't do it. But you'll see an interview report occasionally where people are like, "Oh, I meant to do that. I meant to grab that," and then it's messy if you have to go get up and go find it. So have your photo ID handy. Make sure you're answering the question that's being asked. Ask questions. Have questions ready to ask the interviewer at the end. Be thoughtful about those. Send a thank you email after your interview. And you see some other. Inhale the propaganda of the school at the top of the page. That's a joking way of saying immerse yourself in the days and maybe week or two leading up to your interview. Immerse yourself in the values, the culture, the resources of the school. Have tabs open on your browser, listen to a podcast, watch a couple of videos, go back and speak with those students or alums that you were speaking with 2-3 months ago when you were applying. So get to know that. And apropos today's conversation, research the school, its format, and its interview reports. MBA interview questions. Again, February 11th. Some of these schools, by the way, we have clients who, the schools we're covering today, some of them have already done their interviews for these schools. I know UCLA Anderson was pretty quick with interview invites this year, perhaps especially people with some higher scores. So you might have already done some of these interviews. If so, great. But we're covering 9 schools here, so there's probably still plenty to do. I did a video just a couple of weeks ago for gmatclub about how to respond to, how to approach your answers to the most common MBA interview questions. You could find that via the link below or by looking on elsewhere on YouTube. If this goes up on YouTube, I could probably drop it in the comments as well to link you over to it. So that's where you can look, and that's where you could go to learn more about how to answer and approach these MBA interview questions. But as we think about these 9 schools that we're covering today, let's give ourselves a baseline. Hey, if I were walking into any MBA interview for any school, what should I be prepared for? And when we think about those, I think we want to think about those in 4 buckets of questions. These are categories of my own design, of my own making over the years. Not that they are very, it's not I guess rocket science to come up with these categories. But the intent of this, simplistic as it is to give you a kind of basis. All right, if I'm going into an MBA interview for a quote unquote standard or typical MBA interview, obviously not, not Wharton, which has a team-based discussion, not Harvard, which has its very, very distinct interview style, but a more typical MBA interview, which is pretty much the case for all 9 of these schools. Darden's a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a minute. But if I'm walking into any of those interviews, what 4 question types should I be ready for? And what are some of the questions? What's just like the foundation that I should be ready for? And then we'll look at each school one by one and say to ourselves, all right, how do I customize, or how do I think about little wrinkles that might vary between these? So let's just flip over here. These are the 4 categories, again, of my own making, if you want to call it that. Core questions. I usually say there are 5 of these. Tell me about yourself. You'll sometimes see this as walk me through your resume. What are your short and long-term goals? Why MBA? Why now? Why XYZ schools? So why Haas? Why Tuck? Why Yale? How will you uniquely contribute? And obviously the wording on these can change. The exact combinations in here can change. Whether a school asks a contribution question can vary. We'll talk about some strategy on that. But I think if you're walking into any MBA interview, you want to be ready for these 5 quote unquote core questions and if you're ready for all 5 of them, you'll be ready sort of inherently for situations where a school might say, why MBA, why now, and why Haas? They might combine them. Okay, but if I'm prepared for each of these independently, I could be prepared and nimble for when they get combined or ordered in a different way. Self-awareness questions. These are things like, what is your leadership style? What role do you typically play in a team? I don't see that quite as much as I used to, but still good, I think, to think about. What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And what words or adjectives we'll say others use to describe you? That sometimes I say others there just because sometimes it's colleagues, sometimes it's friends, sometimes it's managers, but these are what I would say call self-awareness questions. None of this is exhaustive, by the way. This is just a baseline. If you're walking into an MBA interview, you're getting ready for a generic MBA interview, a traditional MBA interview, I want you to be ready for these questions. And again, we're going to look for each of these 9 schools at some spin-offs or variations for them as well. We are going to do a mock interview session with the last 45 minutes or so. So about an hour, another hour maybe on this, and then we'll go over and do mock session. So feel free to join that in the quote unquote lounge afterward. Behavioral questions. These are basically just tell me about a time when. They are example driven questions. Now there can be a lot of variance within these. I mean, behavioral questions really, if a school asks them, they could be anything. Tell me about a time you overcame a challenge. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you created something new. Tell me about a time you resolved a conflict. Tell me about a time you received feedback. Tell me about a time you gave feedback. It's on and on and on. There's a lot to be ready for there. But if you go and look at interview reports, as I've done in advance of this, as I kind of do constantly during interview prep, and as you can do on GMATclub, and filter for your school up in the top left, you can start to identify how many behavioral questions a given school asks. Do they usually ask 1? Do they ask 3 or 4? And you'll be able to pick up on those patterns. And you'll be able to identify some patterning in the types of behavioral questions they seem to lean into. We'll look at that for specific schools. It's impossible to predict perfectly, but you can familiarize yourself with those. These, by the way, I mean, behavioral questions, you'll always hear about the STAR method: situation, task, action, result. My preference for that is I call it the SCARL method. Again, you can refer to that other GMAT Club video I did a couple of weeks ago titled How to Answer the Most Common MBA Interview Questions. I'll link it in the comments once this goes up on YouTube. But that will actually show you approaches to to answering every single question I've just enumerated on this page. This is, I'm sorry, mistyped. That's action, action, action. This is result and lessons. Additional questions would be things like, oh, I don't know, what do you do outside of work? I usually use this as my little repository for any questions that I find a certain school asks. Duke, Fuqua, where else have you applied? I'll just usually throw this down, down here. Is there anything else we haven't covered that you'd like to share? Some schools do this more than others. Some interviewers do that more than others. You should be ready for that. Again, defer to that other GMAT Club video to cover that. And then what questions do you have for me? Okay, so this is a baseline. This is, I'm walking into any MBA interview. What should I be ready for? I think if you have this base, you are ready now to tailor or take a more school-specific view on things. Common points of variance between schools. So at the top, I mentioned a few schools that are not, germane to this conversation, but HBS, we know it as a totally distinct interview style and format. It's a little more rapid fire. It's a little more case method based. They've read your whole application. It's 30 minutes, no questions for them at the end. Wharton has the team-based discussion. Stanford has a largely somewhat traditional interview, but they tend to lean into like 3 or 4 behavioral questions. The big difference there is that they probe pretty extensively. Depends on the interviewer how deeply they probe, but they will interrupt and probe as the applicant responds to those behavioral questions. Where a lot of the schools we're covering today, they'll really just let you answer. You'll give your kind of 2 or 3 minute answer. They might have follow-ups after that, but there's a big difference there. Darden is different. We're going to talk about today. Darden is different because it has a pretty all-encompassing opening question. Tell me about yourself. Walk me through your journey. They want you to do that in 10 to 15 minutes. They'll even say that a lot of times in the interview. So it creates this, it's also a totally blind interview, Darden. They haven't even seen your resume. So it creates this almost monologue style opening, like a big monologue style opening. Whereas for other schools, we're trying to keep that opening 2 to 3 minutes. Tell me about yourself. Walk me through your resume. Darden, it's a big, so Darden is the most different format among the schools that we're talking about, the 9 schools we're talking about today. Harvard, Sloan, and Stern have seen your app. Darden is totally blind, meaning not even your resume. The rest of them, they typically have just seen your resume. That's known as a blind. You'll hear semi-blind sometimes. I think most people still say just blind interview, but they have seen your resume. These are the things we're going to be looking out for primarily on the ensuing slides here. Be aware of potential duration and style differences between interviewers. Some of these schools, you could look it up. Some of them will say it on their website. So always go to the website and look at the school's own description of an interview. Some of them will say, we do 30-minute interviews, or others will say 30 to 45. I think Darden says 30 to 45 on their website. Others, you look at interview reports on GMAT Club and you'll see, these seem to go a little longer, 45 to 60. I know Booth, Booth, a lot of times you're interviewing with an alum, and those I feel like go 45 to 60 minutes. Yale, Anderson, NYU Stern, pretty tight to 30 minutes. How many questions can you get in 30 minutes? 7? So watch out for those patterns, duration differences, style differences between interviewers. How consistent do a school's interview questions seem to be? You'll be able to observe that in the interview reports. What is their preferred opener? Do they say, is it tell me about yourself? Do they use the classic opener, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume? Or do they have a little bit of a different spin on that? We talked about behavioral questions. How many and what? Any tendencies or patterns you could pick up on? Any kind of funky behavioral questions you really want to make sure you're ready for because they're, different than some of the others. Any common one-offs? I mentioned Duke, Fuqua asking where else you've applied. Columbia Business School is the other school that commonly does that as well. NYU, Cornell, do certain schools ask about a plan B, or do they really probe into your goals? Yale, we'll see a couple of these one-offs related to what you might do between now and when you and when you enroll, and so on and so forth. All right. In we go. Berkeley Haas up first. I loosely ordered these by the number of behavioral questions that they ask. So I'm starting with ones that I'd ask like 2, 3, or 4 behavioral questions, and then working down toward the ones that might typically ask 1 or so behavioral questions. It's a little imperfect, and again, it can vary by interviewer. You could say, Greg told me I should expect 2 or 3 or 4 interview questions, and I only got 1. That totally happens. That's just people. The individual interviewing holds the keys, holds the power over like what exactly they ask. So there can certainly be some variance in here. Haas, figure about 45 minutes, blind, only your resume, student or alum. I do have on each of these pages, by the way, it's highlighted in like light green. I mentioned a few slides ago, inhaling the propaganda of the school. That's a tongue-in-cheek phrase, but it basically means get to know everything about these schools, values, culture, resources. Picture yourself there. Why Haas for you? Why you for Haas? Why Haas? And what can you contribute? Think about for every school and get to know so basically with these green strips, I basically just lined out like a few things for you to make sure you're thinking about for each school. For Haas, if you don't know the 4 defining principles cold, and you haven't thought about why they attract you to Haas and why you're attracted to that backbone of Haas culture, you really need to take more time to prepare for your interview. Those should be part of your why Haas answer. Haas's other questions, its behavioral questions, are oftentimes, directly or indirectly filtering for these 4 defining leadership principles. Think about location for Haas at the epicenter of innovation. Why is that relevant to your goals? What opportunities does that create? Haas has an impact focus. Many of these schools do. And look, I only put what can fit on one line of size, 18 font. So there's plenty more you need to get to know about all these schools beyond just that one line. For Haas, we looked at this baseline, right? Now for Haas, one thing to watch out for is I would say that some of their core questions are a little more likely to be combined. What do I mean by that? So here's a Haas interview question bank. It is not official. It's not from them. It is my own triangulation and you can do exactly this. And that's what I'm hoping I'm giving you the tools to do. Think about these categories of questions and what that baseline is that we looked at. Now go to GMAT Club's interview reports and look through some recent interview reports, and you'll be able to triangulate these patterns. Now, what do I often see with Haas? I often see a combination in here. So whereas your baseline preparation might be, what are my goals? Why MBA? Why now? Why Haas? I want to be ready for Haas. I want to be ready for combinations. Why MBA? Why now? Why Haas? And you see, look at all the different ways that this can get worded. Another thing you'll observe here is, hey, is Haas always asking my goals? They're not really always explicitly asking your goals. I see it sometimes, or I might see it after, or you might see it kind of baked into the wording in here. So be ready. What do you do? Have a strategy. What do you do if you're prepared for all 3 of these independently? What do you do for Haas if you get them all kind of combined? And what do you do if they haven't asked you your goals yet? Do you need to preface here? If why MBA is if your goals are an important part of why MBA, then do you need to preface a little bit in the beginning with a shorter version of your goals? Do you want to kind of marry your why MBA and why Haas, kind of marry them together and then address why now afterward? These are things, again, these are kind of let you know what to watch out for here. We can't go into the depths of we could spend 15 minutes talking strategy and constructing, different permutations of this. I did another video on GMAT Club, how to answer the most common MBA interview questions, where that's addressed. And obviously feel free to reach out and we would workshop this for you specifically, you individually, and help you come up with your approaches to these, both as standalone questions and in combination. And if we do, maybe we can do a little bit of this in the mock interview session afterward if you join in the lounge. Other things for Haas. Hey, how about this? Haas seems to have One or two questions about DEI. If you applied there, you'll remember they have an essay question about this as well. In recent years, it's been the DEI-JB essay question: diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and belonging. In Haas's interview, we do see a couple different patterns here. We see, I often see it, so even within this, different permutations. I'll often see some question about how you'll contribute in the spirit of DEI at Haas, and or a question about how you have fostered DEI in the past. Even within this, there are some subtleties. There's a difference between what kind of DEI experience do you have. That's kind of an open-ended question that might allow multiple examples. And tell me about a time you fostered diversity or DEI in a professional or non-professional setting. So think about DEI, how you've embodied it. You've written an essay about that for Haas already. Think about it from both a backward-looking perspective, how you have embodied it in the past. Be ready for multi-example or single-example versions of that. Be ready, just in case, for professional or non-professional examples of that. And be ready to say how you will kind of channel these forward into contributions at Haas. Strategically, you could even say to yourself, you know what? If I get this, how do you hope to contribute from a DEI perspective at Haas? Maybe I open that with a little bit, maybe the first 1/3 of my answer is how I've embodied it in the past. And then the next 2/3 is make sure you answer the question, how I will embody it very specifically, not just I'll do, run for this off. Don't just say I'm going to join some club or run for the president of some club. Say what you are going to do as president or VP of that club in that leadership role. Have a very specific idea. And then conversely, if you get the backward-looking version, tell them about how you've fostered it in the past. Okay, make sure you answer that. But do you want to maybe, knowing that they are also sometimes interested in how you'll contribute DEI-wise at Haas, maybe you transition the back end of that answer into how you will contribute. So be ready for these backward-looking, forward-looking combinations. But Haas, DEI is great to think about, of course, for every school, but Haas has a more explicit orientation toward it in the interview. Behavioral questions, I'm going to say 2 or 3 for Haas. They are often kind of specific. Let's go back to our interview report here. What I've done here, again, amalgamating and triangulating from interview reports. Let's look for, can we theme these out? There's a ton of different ways these get worded, but if we theme them out, you can identify the patterns just as I have. And again, not official, not exhaustive. You could get anything, but it feels like they pretty commonly ask the aforementioned DEI question, a question about perhaps building consensus, but look at all the different ways it could get worded. Biggest risk, time you were proven wrong. Hey, confidence without attitude at Haas, one of the 4 defining leadership principles. A time you were proven wrong can help reveal how you act with humility, motivating others, persuading others to adopt your opinion, resolving conflict, overcoming a challenge, boosting morale, questioning the status quo, an ethical dilemma. I mean, it's really a whole host, but you'll see these patterns. You'll see patterns within, and remember to lean on that SCARL approach. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Situation, challenges, action, 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 result, lessons. The differences here from the STAR method are, I want you to think about multiple actions. STAR method, if you think of 1A, it's like I waved a tell me about this grand conflict you were faced with. Well, you waved a magic wand and everything was great? No, we have to think about, first I did this, then we did this, then we did this. A little bit of body to these actions. Results are important, of course, but what about the lessons? Looking back on the experience, what did you learn? What insight did you glean? What did you extrapolate and take forward to some other experience thereafter? Even if they don't say, what did you do and what did you learn? In the essay prompt, it is assumed that you should be, you're telling at a time you resolved conflict. Okay, tell them how you resolved the conflict and what you did and what you learned, what the result was, what you learned. So that's a quick run on Haas. Tuck, 30 to 45 minutes with Tuck admissions associates. Usually these are trained second-year students. Tuck, one of the few schools, as I'm sure you all know, out there where you can actually, guarantee yourself an interview if you apply by a certain date ahead of round 1 and ahead of round 2. Pretty classic opening question for Tuck. I would say, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. That's what these acronyms mean. I do see some occasional exceptions. You'll see, tell me something that's not on your resume. Or why did you choose to do this? So just be ready. Look through the interview reports and identify the consistency with which you think a certain school asks or varies from that classic opening question. Tell me about yourself, or walk me through your resume. Tuck, I would say, pretty classic array of core questions. Contributions are often asked, but not always. You want to be ready for that. Behavioral questions for Tuck, my recent read on that, let me pull it up. Again, all things you can look at on interview reports and do exactly what I showed you with Haas. You can do it yourself, but just kind of quick and dirty for Tuck. Be ready for receiving feedback, giving feedback. That's kind of different. A lot of schools will ask that. I think I've seen it for Fuqua too. You always want to, that's a different, receive feedback's more common. Giving feedback, that's a little different. Tuck, tell me about a time you helped out a team member. Tell me about a time you empowered others. What is your proudest accomplishment? Be ready for that for every school. Tell me about a time you failed. Tell me about a time you worked with a difficult person. Tell me about a time you took initiative. Tell me about a time you stepped outside your comfort zone. Things like giving feedback, helping out a team member, empowering others, these tie in a sense to Tuck's focus on, to one of Tuck's 4 admissions criteria, which you should be ready for and make sure you want to appeal to. One of them is that Tuck students are encouraging. It used to be nice, but encouraging, it means kind of helpful and empathetic. So you'll see some orientation of the behavioral questions around that. We're not going to do for every school what we did for Haas, but you can do that by, taking this rubric and using your own read of the interview reports. I would rely on real interview reports, not some website that purports to kind of say, these are what Tuck usually asks. I think you want real interview reports written by people who actually just, or in the last year or two, interviewed with the school. Tuck, what do I have here? 0 to 2 self-awareness questions. Let's just pull up. Let's see if anything jumps off the page on here. Is it under Dartmouth? No, it's under Tuck. All right. So this is just kind of a classic interview report right here up front. Walk me through so here, okay, a little bit of a different intro. They asked me for a briefer intro rather than the typical tell me about yourself. Then they went into the more detailed, walk me through your resume. They had 2 follow-ups on that. Why MBA? Why now? Why Tuck? If we read that literally, then the goals were not asked in this interview. And you would have to say to yourself, okay, I always want to be ready to share my goals. But if they omit that, if they go right into why MBA, why now, without yet asking my goals, should I preface perhaps with a shorter form of my goals in the beginning of that why MBA, why now answer? I think you probably should. That doesn't mean that all of your why MBA reasons have to be explicitly or exclusively career related, but you do want to be, some of them are going to be related to your goals. So they probably need to know your goals a little bit to understand your why MBA. Why Tuck? Biggest achievement, feedback given and taken. There, I just talked about. Something for the AdCom. That's kind of a fun question I think I see for Tuck. It's really a version of this. Is there anything else you haven't covered that you'd like to share? Is there anything else you'd like to leave me with? For Tuck, I think we do see sometimes this version like, is there anything else you want the AdCom to know about you before we wrap up? Oftentimes it will come right at the end before they say, do you have any questions for me? Be ready for something there. Is there, for that traditional version of that question, if there's something you really left out earlier, if you didn't get to share your contributions, by the way, in this interview report, we actually don't see a question about the contributions. Yeah, so and then in the next interview report, we do see it. What sets you apart and how are you going to contribute to Tuck? Well, what if you didn't get it here? Maybe they didn't get it because it was already part of their why Tuck answer, which would be fine as well. But if not, could I use this kind of safety valve question to say, to share it there, to use it as a safety valve? If you've already covered everything, and is there something else about your special sauce or something that really you believe differentiates you as an applicant that you'd want to make sure you share there. You definitely don't want, if they say, is there anything else you want to share or anything else you want the AdCom to know? Don't just put your hands in your pockets and not have an answer there. It's a huge waste of opportunity. So think about that. Be ready for that. Look out for these wrinkles. Self-awareness questions, again, just in a cursory read here. 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses. That feedback combo again. Feedback that was given and that was taken. So that, I think, is a quick and dirty on Tuck. For Tuck, wise leadership. Think about its location as well. That really immersive experience at small class size. Tuck builds a lot of its programming through its 6 centers. Get to know those, which ones fit with you. Again, how will you uniquely contribute? Duke Fuqua, 45 to 60 minutes, a little longer. Okay. They also have some in-person options. At Fuqua, look, I have this in quotes here. Make sure you know how to pronounce it, right? I'd say that with spelling too. A lot of people, you'd be shocked how many people I see who are applicants. They reach out, they say they're applying to Kellogg and they leave one of the G's off of Kellogg. They say they're applying to Berkeley, they misspell Berkeley. They say they're applying to Duke Fuqua, and you could look online and find YouTube videos from the school that actually tell you how to pronounce it. My favorite is one that says, you could think of it as 1qua, 2qua, 3qua, a Fuqua. Kind of a catchy or cheeky thing they did, but Fuqua. Be ready to know how to pronounce it. Decent. They have other themes there. The decency quotient, DQ, team Fuqua, consequential leadership. Look up and get to know those. Some variation on the openers for Duke Fuqua. I don't know if I'd call it 50-50, but let me check my notes for some examples. Yeah, I think for some of these lately for Fuqua, you're seeing, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, the classics. But then you also might see a question that goes right into one of your hobbies on your resume, or a shared interest, or I've seen, why have you chosen the sector in which you currently work? So I don't know, maybe the classic opener 60% of the time, but I'm increasingly some variation. So look at those, pay attention to those, do that for every school. Fuqua here is just a good example of that because we actually are seeing a little bit more stray in the opening question. This is kind of what we just talked about for Tuck. The big one, I think a couple here. Let's go up and look at Fuqua. So more self-awareness questions. You might say, all right, you know what? Maybe this doesn't matter because I'm going to be ready. I'm going to be ready for these anyway, right? But yeah, this is a little bit of a longer interview up top here, this first one, 1 hour and 45 minutes. So I was talking about duration variation. This is one of the most extreme examples you'll come across. So with a student who went for 1 hour and 45 minutes, that's very uncommon, but it is what it is. Strengths, weaknesses, leadership style. What does the decency quotient mean to you? That's a very Fuqua specific question. And you can see some of those in there. Behaviorals for Fuqua. Yeah, again, just looking for specific patterns that each school seems to prefer. Just off the top here, again, giving feedback for Fuqua. We saw that with Tuck. Tell me about a time you gave feedback to a mentee or colleague. What did you learn about yourself through the situation? Tell me about a time you dealt with someone who is excluding others. That's a pretty, it says DEI vibes to it, but that's a pretty specific behavioral question. It's not just overcame a challenge. It's a really specific theme. Tell me about a time you explained a difficult concept to someone. Tell me about a time you had a problem communicating. And again, we're not going to be able to cover every single one of these. Tell me about a time you worked in a diverse team. Tell me about a time you worked with a team member who didn't pull their weight. Tell me about a time when listening made a difference. Tell me about a time you faced an ethical dilemma. Tell me about a time you encountered failure. So just look and sleuth and attention to detail. Focus on what the nuances are between the behavioral questions. There's some of them are going to be kind of pan school and apply to multiple schools. Others are going to be pretty specific, and you might kind of only see them a certain school asking that hyper targeted of a behavioral question. Again, I mentioned self-awareness questions, more self-awareness questions for Fuqua. And these could be kind of self-awareness or team and leadership awareness questions. What three things do you think are important to a successful team? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What is your leadership style? What is your communication style? Who is a leader that you admire most and why? What is one quality that people would look up to you for? What words would colleagues use to describe you? So I think we do see a little bit more weight in this self-awareness question bucket. Again, self-awareness questions being this, not exactly or only this, right? I just said, what is your communication style? You're going to see some variance in and around that. I just said, who is a leader you admire most and why? That is, it's not about you. It's self-awareness question insofar as it reveals what you value in a leader. And you might talk about how that influences your own leadership style. Where else have you applied? Difficult question to answer, probably too much to kind of parse through in a situation like this. Maybe we take that over to the mock session afterward. And obviously, if you're interviewing with Fuqua or Columbia, who also frequently asks this question, let's prep together. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about all these questions, mock it out, workshop it, and think about your approach to that. Michigan Ross. Michigan Ross, kind of a classic MBA interview, 45 to 60 minutes with some variation. These are all virtual these days, conducted by a Ross alum, according to their website. That's their stated policy. I think you'll see some occasional exceptions to that. Classic opening question. With an alum doing the interview and a longer interview, I feel like there is this greater possibility of probes and follow-ups. So contrast this with UCLA, Yale, 30 minutes, little variation. UCLA, Anderson, 30 minutes, little variation. NYU Stern, 30 minutes, little variation. At Michigan Ross, if it's 45 to 60 with an alum, there's just more conversation that's going to occur. You should expect a greater degree of probing. A lot of times it'll come toward the beginning of the interview. Like if you do tell me about yourself, and maybe there'll be a couple of follow-ups in there. Doesn't mean there will be, but there are greater possibilities for you to tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume. And then they start asking some other questions along the way. Behavioral questions here, pretty good lean. 3 to 4 behaviorals is a nice amount of behaviorals. I think that's about as high as you'll see for any MBA interview. Just to rattle a few thematically off there, again, not exhaustive, not official. You need to go to your interview reports and try to triangulate this yourself. Tell me about a time you led a team. Tell me about a time you received difficult feedback, motivated someone to do better. Tell me about a time you had to lead a project with no background or prior knowledge. That's a pretty cool one. Very specific. Tell me about a time you had to lead a project with little background or prior knowledge. Tell me about a time when things got lost in translation. Tell me about a time you had a poor communication experience with someone. By the way, those are both communication related, implicit in all of these. I said it before. How did you handle it and what did you learn? Even if they don't ask that, that is the actions, the result, the lessons of the SCARL approach that I've talked about. Tell me about a time you had to understand someone else's perspective in order to solve a problem. Tell me about a time you had to work with people from different backgrounds. Tell me about a time you had to be in an unpopular position in your workplace. Tell me about a time you faced an organizational change. Tell me about a time you faced conflicts and had to persuade someone, and so on and so on and so forth. Tell me about a time you failed. Let's flag this. Watch the clock here, and then just flag this on the contributions. For schools that don't ask an explicit contributions question, you really do want to make sure that somewhere in the interview you get those. Actually, let's just address it now. What if a school asks,
these, or certainly this, like we're doing Ross right now, why Ross, but they don't ask this. How do I handle that? My default view is that you should make sure you find a way to communicate how you will uniquely contribute or impact the school within the interview. So even if they don't ask that question, a couple strategies here. One option is that within your why Ross or why whatever school, you take a multi-pronged or kind of bucketed approach. Maybe you want to watch my other video, how to answer the most common MBA interview questions. I'll put the link down in the comments. You could consider making one of your buckets how you would contribute or how you'd plan to contribute. That's an option. It would take up some space, but it's an option. Another option is at the very end of your why Ross articulation, you could say something like, so those are, several of the reasons why I'm so interested in Ross, why I believe Ross will propel me toward my goals. I'm also happy to share how I believe I can uniquely contribute to Ross. Or I've also spent a lot of time thinking about how I can uniquely contribute to Ross and what impact I can leave or what I can bring to the class. Would it be okay if I spend a moment or two to share those, thoughts as well? You could do that as kind of a tee up or a lead up. You're setting up something you hope they'd ask, and you want to make sure you get across. And maybe they were going to ask, but maybe not. And now you've just very, I think, politely, gently, delicately woven that in or set yourself up for it. Another option, probably the final option, I think if all else fails, is if you do get that question at the end that says, is there anything else you'd like to share? And that antenna in your head is sounding off saying, oh no, I didn't share my contributions. You could say, you could use that opportunity there to kind of say, I think we've covered a lot. Really appreciate all your questions. I think we've covered a lot. Earlier in our conversation, I talked quite a bit about all the reasons I'm so interested in Ross, and I believe it's such a great fit. One thing I didn't cover in depth was how I believe I can uniquely contribute. Would it be okay if I spend a moment or two to share some of those thoughts here? And you can do that later on. So those are some options there. And that's what I mean by this. That's what I mean by determine your strategy about contributions. For Ross, action-based learning, learning by doing. Why do you fit with learning by doing? Why is that a good fit for you? Don't just name the thing. Say why their action-based learning approach and learning by doing, which they put even greater emphasis on than many other schools, why that's such a good fit for you. Look at their fast tracks, their career results, and so forth. We'll rifle through a few more of these. A lot of what we're covering, of course, it's sort of cumulative, right? So we don't necessarily need to spend as much time on each of these ensuing schools. Yale, 30 minutes. I see little variation on this. It's a pretty tight 30 minutes. If you look at the interview reports for Yale, you're seeing a lot of like 7 and 8 question interviews. Same thing with UCLA Anderson. Yale does have some on campus. I think it's like every Friday in February, or there's a few of these coming up on campus if you're, I guess, nearby enough, or if you can make the trip. Big thing for Yale, about 75-80% of the time, I see a different opening question. I see them opening with your proudest achievement or your proudest professional achievement. So tell me, what is your proudest achievement? What is your proudest professional achievement, proudest accomplishment? I see that more often as an opener than the classic, tell me about yourself. Be ready for that proudest achievement. Be ready for the different permutations. What if they say professional? It has to be professional. If they omit the word professional, then it could be personal or professional. So be ready for proudest professional, proudest personal, or if they don't specify which one you would go with. It's a little bit of a behavioral question, but it's also not. I think the bigger thing with proudest achievement is why it's so proud to you. So whereas a traditional behavioral question, you're going through the SCARL approach, situation, challenges, action, 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 result, lessons, beginning, middle, and end. For a proudest achievement answer, I kind of like summarize the story in the beginning, but then give 2 or 3 really interesting reasons why it's so meaningful to you. Look out for that here. Yale will ask you about a quote. We'll ask you to submit a quote that's meaningful to you, that resonates with you in advance of the interview. I actually have, like I did for Haas earlier. So here again, there's that opener. These are just my own estimates, obviously. If we scroll down into this miscellaneous area, excuse me. Yeah, there we go. Tell me more about the quote you submitted. Why is it meaningful to you? What does that quote mean to you? You mentioned this quote in the interview prompt. What does it mean to you? You look at all the different variations of that. So be ready to answer why it's meaningful to you, but then also think about it. You could see this in the patterning of the different questions that get asked. Sometimes you'll get asked, it's kind of like that Haas DEI question earlier. How have you embodied it in the past? And or how does it inform how you will contribute at Yale? So why is it meaningful to you? How have you embodied it in the past? How does it inform how you would contribute at Yale? Listen to exactly what is being asked of you in that question here. But on top of that, you could, if they say, why does this resonate with you and how have you embodied this in the past? You can still answer that, of course, but you can still then proactively drive toward, or channel that into how you will channel it into contributions at Yale as well, and vice versa. If they ask, why is this quote meaningful to you, and how will you kind of channel it into your Yale SOM experience, you can still open with like how you've embodied it. Maybe you make that a third of the answer to make sure that the 2/3, the fatter part of the answer, is actually addressing how you'll channel it at Yale. Be specific, be thoughtful about that. That's probably the biggest, or one of the bigger wrinkles with Yale. Others, I think, you see these for Yale a little bit. What research did you do prior to deciding to do an MBA? Columbia, by the way, not part of this conversation. I see questions like this too, like what steps did you take to research your goals? So look out for these. What are your plans between now and going to business school? This ties a little bit to that Yale goals essay, that really short answer goals related essay they have in their app. What are your goals? Which is a lot. I think they ask you to package a tight word count there in that essay. But what are your goals? What experience do you already have, or what steps have you taken to prepare for these goals? And what else do you need to do? That's the essay prompt in the app. But this kind of ties to that, right? Like they want to gain a level of comfort with the steps you're taking to like prepare for your goals and make sure you're ready. So think of a multi-layered and specific, there are several things I'm doing in order to take steps. Or I know that consulting recruiting starts, the moment we arrive, even maybe a little bit before that. So there's several steps I'm already taking in order to make sure I'm fully prepared to hit the ground running with consulting recruiting in August. The first is networking, and then explain that. The second is, are you taking any courses? Are you doing anything on management consulted? And then the third thing is, and it's something else. So think about that. Research, same thing. What research did you just do prior to decide? Don't make it sound willy-nilly. Make it sound like, which we hope it is, something where you really did multiple layers or types of research. Talking with students and alumni, speaking with coworkers, going to visit campus, whatever, give it layers, give it body. Behavioral, something a little funny for Yale is, some schools do this. If you read on their website, they'll say, we ask behavioral questions. I think in practice, in this 30-minute interview, if you really look at the interview reports, I think you usually see one behavioral question for Yale. Maybe you'll get more, maybe you'll get two, maybe they'll stray, but it's usually, I see one behavioral question for Yale. Frequently of late, I'm seeing, tell me about a time you worked with someone who had a different opinion than you, or tell me about a time you navigated conflict. But look at the interview reports yourself, try to triangulate around that, and obviously be ready for others. But you might see some frequency that accumulates around those. UCLA Anderson. Something quirky here is a lot of times for Anderson, you don't know who you're interviewing with in advance. A lot of other schools will kind of tell you or show you somehow. They're even, whether email correspondence or just who sends the invite, or when you click and in the portal, you'll be able to see. For Anderson, you often don't know. So, all right, it does help to know a little bit to inform questions you might ask at the end of the interview, and even just to acclimate yourself mentally. Some people have taken to, potentially logging in early, a few minutes early, which you should do as a good practice anyway, just to be prompt and punctual and on time. But if you do that ahead of time, you can often see who you're interviewing with. And maybe you do a quick Google, or student, like what industry do they work in, and that might inform some of the questions you ask at the end of the interview. Wrinkles here that we haven't covered for other schools. I feel like I do see contributions a lot of time for Anderson, but make sure you're ready even if you don't get that. We talked a few minutes ago about strategies for that. Potentially an extra emphasis on clubs and involvement. I mean, like you should be talking about these things in your why Anderson answer and in your contributions answer. So hopefully they're there already, but I do see a little extra press or a little extra probe around those. So look at the interview reports, be ready for some extra depth around clubs and involvement, the impact you can leave. This is a big one. What is your backup plan if you can't get your first choice job? That is a plan B career question. What is your plan B? So with that, we want to think about, is this school thinking through the lens of like, where are you going to place? Where employment report wise, career wise, are you in good stead? Are you going to land somewhere solid? So I think you have your primary goals that you've shared in the app and probably through another answer here. And then what is your backup plan? You got to think of that about that ahead of time. Is the backup plan in the same industry as you've already articulated? Sometimes in consulting, you'll see people talk about, different types or tiers of consulting. Obviously, people want to go join MBB, but if they can't break into like front office management strategy consulting, are there other types of more like quasi-technical consult? The Cognizance of the world. If you're applying from, we have applicants from India, for example, where you're navigating some of the visa and sponsorship dynamics, and you want to make sure that you feel credible and you're going to land somewhere in the eyes of the admissions committee, and strategy consulting might be your first choice, but a backup plan. What about these other types of consulting that still also hire a lot of international students, including from India? I think your backup plan should be credible. It should feel probably more likely than your main goal, more likely that you're going to land safely there. Sometimes the first time I hear people do this just off the top of their head, their goals will be like, investment banking. And then I'll say, well, what is your plan B? And we haven't practiced it yet. And they'll tell me product management. And I'm like, ooh, that's like maybe even harder and it doesn't fit with your profile. So this takes some thinking. It takes some layering. I think sometimes here you could even think about a plan B and a plan C. I think you want these to still appeal to your skill set and your experience. And I think you want them to still accrue toward your eventual goal. How can you use that to still channel back toward those medium and long-term goals? So plan B deserves thought. UCLA is not the only school that asks it, but we do see it quite frequently there. I think approximately one behavioral for Anderson. A lot of times I'm seeing overcame a challenge or worked in a diverse team, but as always, read the interview reports. It's not only going to be those. NYU Stern, 30 minutes. They've read your entire application. It is usually admissions. I've seen them use other kind of professional staff from the school. I had a client once who was interviewed by the head of Stern's career services group. I think in part because this applicant had a very, very non-traditional pre-MBA experience. So they wanted the career person to really filter and vet for this person's goals and where they might potentially be headed. Opening question, because they've read your app. The opening question for NYU Stern is often related to your Pick 6 presentation. Tell me more about that. Tell me more, and they'll pick one. Tell me more about that slide or that theme, or there could be different versions of this question. A lot of extra probing on goals here. So different versions of this too. Like, what is let me see if I could grab a couple of actual plan B. What's your plan B post MBA if your plan A doesn't work out? So just like Anderson that we just talked about. What are some companies you target for an internship or full-time role? Those should be in your regular answer. What are you planning for a summer internship? What firms are you interested in? And what are your recruiting strategies? So recruiting strategies is a big one. The point being here, just look alternative career choice. That's a plan B question as well. The point being here, just be ready for some extra goals related probing. What is your recruitment? So you might share your goals and then maybe why MBA. And then they might say, tell me more about your recruitment strategy to ensure that you're successful in recruiting into investment banking. How about that as a standalone question? That is more hyper targeted than you would typically see for other schools. There, have an answer. Think about it in advance. What are the steps? What resources at NYU Stern will you use? You might have touched on some of these in your why Stern or why MBA answer, but here you could go into greater depth about the recruiting strategy. In particular, have multiple fronts to that recruiting strategy, not just kind of a willy-nilly thing. Plan B, internship questions, etc. A little more of a lean into self-awareness questions. We've talked quite a bit about those. Leadership style, strengths, what words would others use to describe you? I'm going to say approximately one behavioral question here as well in that 30-minute space. There's not a ton of time for a lot of questions. If I had to pick or put a number on it, tell me about a time you worked in a diverse team. Tell me about a mistake you made and how you overcame it. You'll see these little onesies coming up. What are the weaknesses in your application? That's a self-awareness question. What is your leadership style? What accomplishment are you most proud of? So look out for the behavioral patterning. Last but not least, Cornell. Oh no, I have Darden after this, and then we'll hop over to the other room for the mocks. I think this should line up with roughly what I was intending, about 75 minutes on the presentation, and then we'll do like 45 over in the breakout room. Cornell Johnson, 30 to 40 minutes, blind, maybe some AdCom notes. Sometimes AdComs will throw a note or two to an interviewer saying, hey, make sure you probe about this, or please ask about this, or please clarify that. You'll see this for some schools. Sometimes I see it a little more commonly for Cornell Johnson, just so you're not thrown off. Sometimes there'll be a listener in the room, like a second person taking notes. If the AdCom person is interviewing you, it might be a second-year student taking notes, or vice versa. So just don't get thrown off by that. HBS does that decent amount also. Some variation in the opening question. Often tell me about yourself, but sometimes interests or why. Tell me about yourself, just to rattle through a few here. Tell me about yourself. Why did you choose your current employer? How about that for an opener? Tell me why you chose your school, your major, and your job. Tell me more about your interests. So a little bit of variance. Always be ready for that. Pretty classic core questions. Always watch out for those combos. Watch out for a why Ithaca question in there. So here, two things. Why Ithaca? Ithaca is the city in which Cornell's located. I think your why Cornell Johnson answer should proactively include a why Ithaca or a location element to it. And that's true of many other schools as well. And you just have to tailor that to the situation in the school. What do you have with Ithaca? What do you have with Cornell Johnson? You have a vibrant college town or small college city where a relatively small MBA class size can truly immerse themselves and build deep relationships. At the same time, you have very good proximity to New York, to Boston. You have the network. So, I mean, when you think about Ithaca, Ithaca is beautiful in other ways as well. So look into Ithaca, come up with your answer for that. But it's as much about Ithaca as it is, I think, about the how a location or environment influences the experience in the MBA program, what it creates on campus, the dynamic it creates on campus, where people live, how people interact, what the center of gravity is, how immersed they are, the relationships you build, while also having the simultaneous benefit of proximity. This could benefit recruiters come to town in Ithaca or Tuck or other places, and they're kind of like people hear them referred to sometimes as kind of this captive audience for recruiting. They're there. A lot of times they're spending the night there. They're hosting their drink sessions or networking events. So think about why. I think it should be part of your why Cornell Johnson response, but be ready. I do see one-offs on this for Cornell as well. Some extra goals probing. We see Plan B show up here as well. We see some of these questions around what are your motivations, deeper dive. Motivations for your goals should be part of your goals answer to begin with, but maybe a deeper press into that. What preparations have you taken? What cities are you interested in working in? Make sure you include that. Sometimes you could tell these extra questions they ask, the nature of those extra questions can serve as little hints as to what should be in your main answer to begin with. So why Ithaca, I talked about location being a part of your main why Cornell Johnson answer, not the majority of it, but a piece of it. If you have 4 parts, maybe it's one of them. where location, what your motivations are for your goals, where geographically you want to work. Those should be part of your goals answer to begin with, but be ready for extra probes. Anyway, what preparations have you taken in order to kind of get these jobs, be ready for these jobs? We saw something similar on that a little while ago. A big behavioral question I'm seeing, kind of a quirky one for Cornell Johnson a lot of times. Tell me something you've done well. I don't even know if it's quite a behavioral question. It's maybe a little spin or twist on a behavioral question. Tell me about something you've done well or have done multiple times that you wouldn't want to do again. That's really a one-off question. That's an interesting and unique school-specific question. Go into the interview reports, take a look at that. Now, last but not least, Virginia Darden, 30 to 45 minutes, totally blind, not even your resume. They allow open interviews before September 5th. This would be more if you're looking at this ahead of the game for next year, and if they keep that policy. The real big difference here, and let's take a look, and then we'll wrap up. Well, let's look for a more representative example. All right, how about this one? The first 10 to 15 minutes were dedicated to the classic, tell me about yourself. So 10 to 15 minutes on that. The usual tell me about yourself for a school is two. If any other school asks you, tell me about yourself or walk me through your resume, your target is 2 to 3 minutes. You do not want to fall into the, talking for too long bucket. For Darden, and a lot of times now I'll see them actually say, please spend 5 or 10 minutes telling me about yourself, starting with your background, your undergraduate studies, up through your career today, something like that. And they'll kind of indicate that. If you're really unsure, if you're sitting there and you're like unsure, are they asking for the kind of brief overview or are they looking for the longer kind of monologue style answer? Then I think it's okay to ask for clarification. If it's unclear based on the way that it's asked, you could say, just to clarify, would you like me to really walk through in detail, perhaps, over the course of 5 or 10 minutes? Or would you like just a brief overview, 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll go into more specific questions? I think that would be okay if it's not made clear from the way they ask it. But I think a lot of times now it is either very heavily implied, if not outright stated. They will then go into a couple of follow-ups. But if it's a 30-minute interview and that takes 10 or 15 minutes, a lot of times you're looking at 3 or 4 additional questions after that. Look at this hybrid, why MBA, why now, why Darden? 2 sort of behavioral questions here, and then anything else we missed or wanted to add. Nice job, by the way, I think, by the applicant to, if they felt like they missed out on the things that they hope they could get involved in or contribute, maybe nice job here. But that, I think this is a classic to me. This is a classic Darden interview rubric. We see five questions, call it. Tell me about yourself, but the big monologue version, 5, 10, 15 minutes. Why MBA, why now, why Darden? Maybe 2 behaviorals, and then like, is there anything else, or something like that. Yeah, sometimes at the end you might say, "What is there anything else you do for fun? Here's anything we missed toward the end." Behaviorals, you can look for the patterns. Tell me about a time you faced a challenge. This W means in a workplace. Tell me about a time you worked with people of different backgrounds. They might say, what kind of global experience do you have? I do have this note in here. Prepare for these behaviors. This is true for every school, maybe a little more so here for Darden. Be ready for versions, of course. Tell me about a time you faced a challenge. Tell me about a time you worked with people from different backgrounds. Also be ready for a version that might say, what kind of experience do you have working with people from different backgrounds? Okay, a little different. It's not tell me about a time. It's what kind of experience. It almost allows, rather than a single example, to go through a couple of perhaps shorter examples, but still at the end, talk about the how, or not at the end, within the answer, talk about how you navigated these situations. Maybe key in on one specific example, talk about what you learned through that. The big ticket here, though, is, and it exceeds the confines of a session like this, especially when we're covering 9 schools. You got to consider how you want to structure this opener. and what you want to cover within it. If it is the 5, 10, even 15-minute version, that is giving you a framework basically to go through. Not that everywhere else it's 2 to 3 minutes. It's like a movie trailer. Here, what do you want to key into within each of these? Is there anything interesting about your background? If so, you could go into that in a little more depth here. How do you want to chapterize this so that it actually becomes followable in the list? It doesn't sound like some giant run-on or blah into the ether. How do you chapterize this? Is it your background? Is it college? Is it job 1? Is it job 2? You could almost, whereas in a regular version of Tell Me About Yourself, you might just mention what you were involved in college, or mention a highlight from job 1 or a highlight from job 2. If you have this much time, you could tell a little bit of a story about those. But how are you going to structure this? It's almost like building a monologue or mini presentation, more so than iteratively answering a question. That's the big one, and that's the big difference for Darden. And it is different. It is one of the most different MBA interviews. That kind of does it. We are offering, as I said at the beginning, a 15% discount to event attendees. You can use GMAT 15 on our website. I said it earlier as well. Like a lot of other interview prep opportunities out there, it's like you do a 30-minute mock interview, you do like 30 minutes of feedback. I don't even know how you cut, like, what does somebody tell you in 30 minutes of feedback? Tell you, like, be more specific. We actually help you be more specific. Rather than pay quote unquote full freight for like a 30-minute mock interview and 30 minutes of feedback, we're going to dive in. We're going to sink our teeth in. We'd love to work with you on that. You can visit avantiprep.com to learn more, to fill out a free consultation form, to sign up for interview prep directly. Again, the coupon code is there at the bottom of the page. I think some of these questions we're going to have to take over to the we'll take these questions. I see there's a few in the question bank. Let's take those over to the breakout room, where we'll do some mock interview for those of you willing to answer. I'm gonna throw a question out there, and I guess whoever jumps in and would like to answer that or raise their hand to answer that, they can give their version of that answer, and then we can workshop a response. You'll get a little bit of a flavor for how we do that with applicants, and do it in a, once again, very you-specific way. So we appreciate your time. Thank you all for joining today. We wish you the best of luck with interview prep. We hope to have the opportunity to work with you on that. And we hope to see you out there in MBA application land. Thank you, and all the best.